News Live.
This is an ABC News special report.
I'm Wade Johnson in New York, and we're coming on the air with breaking news. Major developments concerning the classified documents case involving President Biden. Special counsel Robert Hur releasing his 345-page report on the investigation into those documents found at a number of properties linked to President Biden. The report highly critical of his handling of the materials, but saying, quote here, "We conclude that no criminal charges are warranted in this matter. We would conclude the same, even if there is no policy against charging a sitting president. Our investigation uncovered evidence that President Biden willfully retained and disclosed classified information after his vice presidency when he was a private citizen." Now, some of those documents were found at an old office, others found at the president's home in Delaware, including his garage. The materials dating back to his time in the Senate and as vice president. The White House has already seen this report, we're told, and President Biden will not ask for any redactions. But the Justice Department may redact some parts considered classified information. Let's get right to our Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas, as we're dissecting all of this. But, Pierre, that key headline, no charges recommended.
Indeed, with the 345-page report lays out chapter and verse in terms of how President Biden and aides mishandled classified documents in the years before he became president. Some of the mistakes are described as egregious, but ultimately special counsel Robert Hur concluded that these were not prosecutable offenses. Hur takes great pains to lay out his reasoning. He also takes time to spell out how President Biden's case is different from that of former President Trump, who's being prosecuted by a different special counsel for allegedly mishandling classified documents. He says, quote, "Most notably, after being given multiple chances to return classified documents and avoid prosecution, Mr. Trump did the opposite." Hur goes on to say that Trump allegedly enlisted others to destroy evidence and lie about it. He points out that President Biden returned classified documents to the National Archives and to the FBI. And what DOJ officials are emphasizing is that Hur was once a U.S. attorney appointed by former President Trump and that he had complete independence in this investigation. Here's some more specific. As you said earlier, he writes, "We conclude that no criminal charges are warranted in this matter. We would reach the same conclusion even if Department of Justice policy did not foreclose criminal charges against the sitting president." But some of what they found is damning, including evidence that Biden willfully retained classified materials after he left the vice president's office, and that some of those materials were classified, including information about military and foreign policy. There was also information about covert U.S. sources. Agents recovered the documents, as you said, in a garage, office, and even a basement. But Hur concludes that there was not enough evidence to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt with.
All right, Pierre Thomas for us. Thank you so much. Let's bring in our chief Washington correspondent, Jonathan Karl, who's here. We're getting this report. You're reading through it. Of course, John, all of this playing out as former President Donald Trump is scheduled to go to trial for a case of allegedly mishandling classified documents. But what are the key differences in these cases?
Well, there are key differences. But first, Whit, I've been reading through this report, and there are some significant findings here getting to what Biden did, why he retained these documents. And he retained them essentially to write two different books and to document his legacy. This is from the report. He used these materials to write memoirs published in 2007 and 2017 to document his legacy and to cite as evidence that he was a man of presidential timber. What were the documents? Well, some of them had to do with Afghanistan policy. Then Vice President Biden very much opposed a move that Barack Obama, the president, did in 2009 to surge additional troops into Afghanistan. So one of these documents included notes of a classified memo that Biden had written to Obama saying why he opposed it. So it gives you a little bit of a sense of what these documents are and why he had them. But here's a couple of very important distinctions. One, as soon as Biden was asked to return classified documents, he did. There's no obstruction of justice here. Just a reminder of what happened with President Trump. He retained boxes and boxes of classified information. He was asked by the National Archives to return official government records. He returned some. They found out those included classified documents. He was asked if he had any more. He returned about 38 more pages several months later. And then his lawyer certified that he had no more classified documents in his possession. Well, that was in May of 2022. August of that year, what happened? The FBI had reason to believe he had a lot more classified documents. They got a search warrant. They searched Mar-a-Lago, and they found that Donald Trump had over several boxes, 100 different classified documents that he had not turned over, that he had allegedly directed his personnel to lie about those documents, that he had directed an employee of his to destroy surveillance tape of surveillance cameras showing where the documents were kept. So there's a whole series of differences here, but there are. This is going to muddy the waters, and it's going to make it easy for Donald Trump to say, look, he had classified documents, and he wasn't prosecuted. I had them, and they prosecuted me. It's unequal.
Vice President Mike Pence had documents.
Yes. And by the way, there's another very important point, again, going through this, that at least some of these documents were classified at the very highest level of classification, top secret, sensitive, compartmentalized information, TS, SCI. That is the most sensitive, among the most sensitive secrets the U.S. government has, and at least some of the documents had markings up to that level that Biden had stored in his garage in Delaware.
And this also raises questions about sources and methods, too.
Yes,
right? I know we're still looking into it, but...
Yes. And you know, it's important to say that the decision was made here not to prosecute, the special counsel in this case, special counsel Hur, said that part of it is, you know, he lays out the differences between what Biden did and what Trump did, but there's the context here, and I want to read another line here. In addition, Mr. Biden's memory was significantly limited, both during his recorded interviews with his ghostwriter in 2017 and in his interview with our office in 2023. And his cooperation with our investigation included by reporting to the government that the Afghan documents were in his Delaware garage will largely convince some jurors that he had made an innocent mistake rather than acting willfully, that is, with intent to break the law, as the statute requires. So again, to be prosecuted, the prosecutor has to make the case that he willfully had the documents and that he intended to break the law by misrepresenting what he had. So it's interesting here, part of the reason that they're making, this is on page 5 of this report, and it you know, makes the case that part of this is they'll say that his memory was simply faulty on this question.
We'll likely see some people seize on that moment on the campaign trail. We'll get more back into that in a little bit, John. Thank you. But I do want to go to our chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce, who's digging into all of this. And Mary, the key thing that we've heard from the Biden team repeatedly over and over again was that he cooperated with this investigation from the beginning, and he gave those documents back. What's the reaction you're hearing now?
Yeah, well, so far, no official reaction from the White House. You might actually hear the sound of a helicopter behind me. The president is about to depart the White House. We will see if he answers any questions out there on the South Lawn. But yes, to your point, the president and this White House have repeatedly stressed throughout all of this that they have cooperated with authorities, that they have been transparent through all of this. The president stressing that he takes classified documents very seriously. But of course, now the president, bottom line, has a lot of explaining to do, because he said repeatedly in last January, when all of this came to light, that he was surprised to learn that there were any government records at his private office here in Washington or at his private home, and that he didn't know what was in these documents. You'll recall the president at the time said flatly, you're going to find that there's nothing there. He said he had no regrets and that there is no there. Well, obviously, this report is raising some serious questions and concerns about what the president did know and what he did take, you know, finding that he willfully retained and disclosed classified information, though, of course, the report finds that they can't prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. And just to underscore that point, I want to call your attention to something on page 3 of the report here, referencing how the president was writing these books, these memoirs, with the help of a ghostwriter. And it calls out this instance. It says in a recorded conversation with one of those ghostwriters in February of 2017, about a month after he left office, Biden said, while referencing a 2009 memo, that he had just found all the classified stuff downstairs. The question is, that's a pretty, concerning and damning recollection there. The question is going to be, did the president remember any of this? How is he going to explain this given that they have stressed over and over again that the president did nothing wrong, that he didn't recall taking any classified documents?
Mary, thank you. John Carl, I know you've been digging into that exact point as well.
Yes, and keep in mind, what Hur is saying is that he decided not, or he's recommending not to prosecute because he doesn't think he can get a conviction at trial.
Saying they have some evidence, but not enough evidence.
Yes, exactly, and that the context would make it hard to prosecute. But listen to this sentence. Okay, this is on page 6 of this report. We have also considered that at trial, Mr. Biden would likely present himself to a jury, as he did during our interview of him, as a sympathetic, well-meaning, elderly man with a poor memory. Based on our direct interactions with and observations of him, he is someone who many jurors will want to identify reasonable doubt. I mean, this is the special counsel saying that Biden presented himself to them, and I want to repeat these words. Biden would likely present himself to a jury, as he did during our interview with him, as a sympathetic, well-meaning, elderly man with a poor memory.
I mean, I can hear the Trump team right now. I mean, putting T-shirts and slogans together for this exact reason, making the case that he is treated differently than President Biden is when it comes to these classified documents.
Well, this is making a case and justifying a decision not to prosecute, but it's hardly the image that President Biden going into a re-election campaign wants out there.
John, thank you. Let's go to Rick Klein, our political director, with more on this, because obviously this is all playing out in this critical and historic election year. Both campaigns, I mean, we technically haven't determined who the nominee is going to be on the Republican side, or the Democratic side for that matter, officially. But we're going to hear both campaigns talking about this report from the special counsel.
Yeah, and look, if the question of the differing circumstances, the Biden team likes their odds. They're pointing out to me that President Trump is now under series of different federal charges, including a series of charges related to his handling of classified documents. And there's nothing in this report that suggests that his handling of the material was anything like Trump or his alleged efforts to try to obstruct efforts to get those documents back. On the other hand, this identifies some glaring political vulnerabilities. This is a very damaging political report. And you can imagine that same case that the special prosecutor here is talking about potentially being made to a jury about him as a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. It's not just that they could put that on a T-shirt or put it on a campaign bumper. That is the essence of the main case against Joe Biden right now from some Democrats and from many, many Republicans and independents who have worries about his leaderships. And the fact that that now exists in the black and white of a formal report from the Justice Department, from a special counsel, is extremely politically damaging at a very difficult time for a president who's trying to make the case that, yes, not only is he the right choice, but that he is capable and that he is confident about going into this re-election matchup. There is a lot here to chew on that is well beyond the legalities that, again, the Biden team has a good answer for that. They will not have as good an answer for this.
All right, Rick, thank you so much. Let's bring in our legal analyst, ABC News legal analyst, Kate Shaw, on this, because, Kate, John and I were talking a little bit here. In some ways, it reminds us of James Comey, the report against Hillary Clinton and the private email server back in 2016. Do you see some parallels here where the special counsel is essentially saying, look, mistakes were made, but not enough for charges?
There are absolutely echoes of that episode, right? So typically, if DOJ decides not to bring charges, it just doesn't bring charges. It doesn't make a public release of a lengthy report explaining the decision not to bring charges and any potential misconduct by the individual who is being investigated. And so this is atypical. Of course, this is a sitting president, and it does seem as though at every step of the investigation, the president and his team were very forthcoming. So you and John were just talking about the political fallout potentially of the depiction of Biden as, having a failing memory or an elderly man. Of course, that flows directly from his decision to sit for interviews and to cooperate with the investigation, and indeed not to raise any executive privilege objections to the report and to its public release. But the non-prosecution decision is the big news. There was not sufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that there was any willful retention or dissemination, even if there might have been some evidence to that effect. So to my mind, as a legal matter, that's the really important takeaway. But of course, there's enough in this report to make political hay of that I expect that the political takeaway may be as important as the legal takeaway.
And Kate, forgive me for coming back to this, but this is going to be the source of a lot of conversation in the weeks to come. This line here is a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. Is that a reason not to prosecute or file charges? And why, if not, why would that be written in this report?
You know, I think that the assessment was of the entire course of conduct. So you had these documents that were found, obviously, in Biden's possession. So the question was, how and why did they get there? And look, Biden was the vice president for 8 years. When you leave the White House, you take a lot of things with you. Many of these documents at issue were his handwritten notebooks that had contents that were deemed classified. But I guess if there were a lot of questions about why and when and what documents were taken, and maybe there was difficulty on Biden's part recalling some of the specifics, I don't think that's crazy, and I don't think it's legally irrelevant to the question of intent, which is critical to any charging decision.
Kate Shaw Forrest, thank you. Let's bring in Terry Moran, our senior national correspondent, who's actually at the Supreme Court today covering our other big story of the day. But Terry, want to get your take on this report.
Well, it is a bad day for Joe Biden. It was a good day for Donald Trump here in the Supreme Court and a bad day for Joe Biden. And this report, it seems, will deepen and confirm what polls show is one of the major problems in the country right now, which is a pervasive and corrosive cynicism that has taken hold of the public mind, that the game is rigged, that they always get away with it. The insiders get special treatment. And that has not just eroded confidence and trust in leaders, and that is a problem for Joe Biden politically, but in institutions like this court. People increasingly, polls show, don't trust the court to do the right thing. That right across the board is one of the reasons that the politics of this country are so dysfunctional. To have conversation, to have democratic self-governance, there has to be a level of confidence and trust. And this report, which shows that Joe Biden, did what they all do, a lot of people will say, I think will just deepen the cynicism that already has taken hold of the country.
Terry Moran for us, thank you. Pierre Thomas, if we could go back to you, again, as we're going through this report and looking at some of these explanations, another part that I know that we're going to be hearing about is this line about the willful retention of documents. Are you getting any further explanation about that and why the special counsel said that they found some evidence, but not enough to charge or recommend charges?
Right. When you pour into the report, and again, as everyone else has emphasized, there's a difference between the politics of the matter and the legal facts of the matter. One of the things that the special counsel points out as a weakness in the case that he was attempting to build, if you will, is that some of the documents might have been in Biden's home without him knowing that they were there. In other words, they might have been sent inadvertently by others. There's notes that the special counsel concludes contained classified information, but he talks about Biden making the case that he's allowed to take notes about certain things that he did while in office, and that all of his predecessors, including vice presidents and other presidents, had done the same thing. So again, that gets at the intent issue. So at the end of the day, what this comes down to over and over again is that they found some damning evidence, but not enough that they felt that they could go to a jury and get a conviction.
Pierre, thank you. John Carl, we were just talking here, too, as you're going through more of the pages, because we're also getting an understanding of how Biden responded to these interview questions from the special counsel.
Yeah, he sat down for extensive interviews with special counsel Hur on this. And what's interesting, on the question of his notebooks, he insisted that he believed that these were his property. I want to read you exactly what is in this report on this. We expect Mr. Biden's defense at trial would be that he thought the notebooks were his personal property, that he was allowed to take them home even if they contained classified information. During our interview of him, Mr. Biden was emphatic, declaring his notebooks were, quote, my property, and that, quote, every president before me has done the exact same thing. That is, kept handwritten classified materials after leaving office.
You said every president before me.
Yes.
So he wasn't president at the time.
Well, that's a very good point. That's a very good point. But he's also, you get a sense that he got irritated with this line of questioning. This is my property. These are my notebooks. I had every right to take them. Now, look, we saw in a case against David Petraeus years ago, classified notes are classified. You can't, just because you put it in your handwriting, and it still must be kept in the exact same way other classified material is kept. But Biden, according to the special counsel, pointed to the example of Ronald Reagan, who famously kept his daily diary every day while he was in the White House, and that some of those diaries contained classified information, and there was no effort to prosecute Reagan or anybody around Reagan for the fact that some of those diaries actually had material that was classified, and Hur concedes that at trial that would be pretty compelling. And again, it gets to his state of mind. Was he intentionally keeping stuff that he knew that he had to send back? Well, Hur says he should have known that classified notes must be kept classified, but gets to his state of mind. He clearly, at least Hur believes, and a compelling case can be made that he knew, that he believed he had the right to have this material.
Because they were his property.
They were well, in his view, they were his property, and again, falling back on that, faulty memory, elderly man defense as well, that he just honestly didn't know or had reason to believe that he was okay to keep that material even though it was classified.
And again, the comparisons to the Trump case, though, he had said as well, these are my documents. We heard him say it. Obviously, the context was different, and what was happening as Biden was cooperating with investigators, but still some of these quotes are similar.
But let's not forget the most important distinction here, which is as soon as this investigation commences, which happened as a result of the Trump investigation, there was a look to see who else had classified information. Biden went through, conducted this search, turned everything over, turned it over voluntarily, submitted to the sworn interview with the special counsel. This is not the way Donald Trump acted. He kept the stuff back. Even when subpoenaed, he made efforts to try to hide the stuff at Mar-a-Lago, allegedly, and he allegedly told his own staff to lie about the documents.
Very
different than what happened.
Absolutely, yes.
But
and that context is truly important.
In the legal context.
Yes.
But again, the point that Rick made, the point that Terry made, politically, this very much creates problems for Biden because it allows Trump to muddy the waters on this.
Let's go back to Mary Bruce at the White House. Mary, you're learning more.
Yeah, Whit, in fact, we just got a statement from the president's legal team. We are still making our way through this, so bear with me here. But it says they're pleased that the investigation has concluded and that the special counsel found no criminal charges are warranted in this matter. Even if the president were out of office and a private citizen, they underscore and stress the fact that the president self-reported the classified documents that were found, that they cooperated fully with this investigation, that there was no obstruction, that the president has cooperated throughout all of this. They say, quote, the simple truth is President Biden takes classified information seriously and strives to protect it. And they go on to note that they disagree with a number of, and I quote here, inaccurate and inappropriate comments in the special counsel's report. Nonetheless, the most important decision that the special counsel made, that no charges are warranted, is firmly based on the facts and evidence. And I believe what they are referencing there is those comments that we have been discussing that are in this report about the president's memory and his age. And it is notable that actually within this report, Whit, it quotes from a February 5th letter that was sent from the president's legal team to the special counsel's team, where they say, and again, I'm quoting here, this is in the report, quoting this letter that the president's team sent, saying they do not believe that the report's treatment of President Biden's memory is accurate or appropriate. They say the report uses highly prejudicial language to describe a commonplace occurrence among witnesses, a lack of recall of years-old events. So again, I think what you are going to see in the coming days and weeks here, and what we will likely hear from the president at some point, is that this report did not find any criminal charges. They will, I'm sure, stress the differences between this case and their cooperation with authorities here versus how Donald Trump handled his handling of classified documents, which, of course, did lead to criminal indictment and federal charges. And they are certainly going to take issue with their characterization of the president's age and memory, which may be the most politically consequential point of this report as he is heading into a very difficult re-election campaign.
Yeah, very true, Mary Bruce. Thank you. I want to go back to Pierre Thomas here, because Pierre, I know you're learning a few more things, but as we do, I just want to note again, remind our viewers that there are roughly 100 people, witnesses who were interviewed as part of this investigation. That includes Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, even wait staff who were at the Biden property that was hosting an event. But Pierre, what else are you learning here as we dig into this report?
Well, as we look at the report, the politics, again, are damning for President Biden in many people's eyes. But in 30 years of covering the Justice Department, one thing that strikes me is what I heard from sources early on about President Trump, for example. They say the former president forced their hand. All the things that John Carl just talked about, how they gave him opportunity after opportunity to return the documents, that he, dismissed a subpoena. He told other people allegedly not to cooperate. These are the reasons they said that he forced their hand. In this case, they're making the distinction, again, that Joe Biden, once confronted with the issue, cooperated, and that's how they typically handle these cases. That's the difference with.
Pierre Thomas, thank you so much. We appreciate it, and thanks to our entire team. I do believe we have some photos from the report as we conclude this special report here, if we could. There's a photograph specifically inside the garage of President Joe Biden's home. Do we have it? There it is. You can see some of the boxes stacked up there. There was, I believe, a treadmill in the shot, and of course John, the green Corvette that we've heard a lot about.
I mean, this is a very messy garage, a rocking chair, several boxes, presumably in this report because there are boxes that contain the classified information. The treadmill, his famous Corvette, tools in the background. This is a big problem because of politics image. And we know the images of Donald Trump and the boxes of documents that were stuffed at a bathroom in Mar-a-Lago or on the stage in the ballroom at Mar-a-Lago. And here you see boxes stuffed into a garage, willy-nilly, clearly not treated with the respect and the secure way you expect classified documents to be kept.
John, thank you. Terry Moran, your final thoughts there from the Supreme Court.
Well, I think what you've been saying, that this is a huge problem for President Biden and for the country. People are looking for leadership. They're looking for leadership that can get things done and that they can trust. And the combination of what the Supreme Court heard today, the case against Donald Trump in Colorado, based on what the Colorado Supreme Court found was his participation in an insurrection against this country. And now this report saying that President Biden willfully mishandled classified documents, and that the investigators reported the fact that they felt they were dealing with an elderly, well-meaning man who had trouble remembering things. That's a problem for both those men and for the country.
Terry Moran and our entire team, our thanks to you on this very busy news day. Of course, our coverage continues here on ABC News Live and abcnews.com. David Muir will be right back here for a complete full wrap-up on World News Tonight. I'm Wade Johnson in New York. Have a great day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
Our thanks to Whit and the entire team. We want to continue our coverage now here on ABC News Live. And for more, we want to bring in Catherine Falders, senior reporter, Catherine Falders, and senior national correspondent Terry Moran, who you were just listening to there. Catherine, let's start with you. Let's break down what we know is in this special counsel's report.
So the main headlines here are that we're learning from special counsel Robert Hur's report that President Biden did willfully retain classified information. But the important part of this is Hur concluded that no criminal charges were warranted here. And more importantly, of course, the Justice Department has a longstanding policy of not prosecuting a current president. But Hur said that this would be the same. He would conclude the same if Biden wasn't president here. Now, we know some of these facts, especially from the executive summary, that the materials that Biden retained included marked classified documents about military and foreign policy in Afghanistan, notebooks containing Biden's handwritten entries of national security and foreign policy implicating sensitive intelligence sources and methods. We've obviously heard from the White House, who has said that they were glad no charges were recommended here, but lots to go through this report. It's over 300 pages. I think it's worth pointing out, of course, the differences here between President Biden and former President Trump, who has been indicted, is facing 40 criminal counts in this matter. The federal government found out of course, as it relates to former President Trump, that he was holding on to this information and that he allegedly obstructed their probe, refused to give it back, and claimed the information was here. You see that statement right there, that they're concluding that no criminal charges are warranted in this matter. We would reach the same conclusion, this is important, even if Department of Justice policy did not foreclose criminal charges against the sitting president. So those are at least the top lines right now in this report, this hundreds of pages of report. We know that there are photos in here. There are photos, for example, of the garage, of particular boxes. They reference Biden's interview that he did with special counsel Hur, where he sat down and he said that he believed that the notebooks were his personal property. These are just some of the headlines that we're learning from this.
Catherine, thank you. We're also getting more information from our team as they go through this report right now. I want to bring in ABC News Chief White House Correspondent Mary Bruce. And Mary, there will definitely be two discussions about what this report is, what Catherine just laid out for us, and that there's no prosecution coming out of it. But then there is this other sentence and more details we're getting from our team there. This elderly, well-meaning man who had trouble remembering. You're getting some response from the White House this afternoon.
Yeah, and look, I think you make a really important point here. There is sort of the legal matter of this, and then there is the political matter of this. And some of the descriptions in here, the way they describe the president's memory as being really lacking, that is going to be very damaging to the president politically, because of course we know as he heads into what is going to be a very difficult re-election campaign that his age is top of mind for a lot of voters and a huge concern as we head towards November. And I want to just call your attention to one part of this report. It's recalling his interview with the special counsel, and it says his memory, it says, was worse. He didn't remember when he was vice president, forgetting on the first day of the interview when his term ended, and forgetting on the second day of the interview when his term began. They say he did not remember even within several years when his son Beau had died. His memory appeared hazy when describing the Afghanistan debate. So this is, you know, and while the White House is pushing back on this, they are saying it's inappropriate and inaccurate for the special counsel to be, you know, going after the president's age, saying that it's common for witnesses to have issues recalling certain details. No matter how the White House pushes back on this, no matter how the president pushes back on this, in a lot of ways, just the fact that it is in this report is something that Republicans, and certainly I can almost guarantee you Donald Trump, is going to seize upon. So it will be very interesting when we do hear from the president how he explains this, but in a lot of ways the political damage is done.
Absolutely. Mary Bruce, thank you from the White House. ABC News Chief Justice Department Correspondent Pierre Thomas joins me now. Pierre, you just heard how Catherine and Mary laid that out. There is going to be some political fallout for this, but certainly no criminal fallout right now. What are you hearing from your sources there?
Well, the distinction here is that they found some evidence that President Biden, as a private citizen, you know, willfully retained classified information. That's a problem. But they're saying that they could not make a prosecutable case because there was not enough evidence to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, why is that? They're saying that, for example, there are innocent explanations for why some of the documents may have been stored in his home. They could have been sent there by, you know, staff, and he did not know that they had sent this information. That a lot of the information involved notes that President Biden had taken when he was vice president, and I guess as a senator as well, and that in his mind, he was allowed to keep notes, even though some of those notes may have included information about classified information. So the other thing that they do here is that Special Counsel Robert Hur makes the case of why Biden's case is so different from that of President Trump. Namely, that Biden, when it became clear that he had classified documents, cooperated fully, provided the documents, whereas former President Trump defied a subpoena, allegedly, and encouraged other people not to cooperate with the government's attempt to get back the classified information. Also, that former President Trump has a significant amount more classified documents, not notes, but actual classified documents marked in that particular fashion. So again, this is what you see the Justice Department operating as the nation's biggest law firm, prosecutors, if you will, saying we're applying the same standard to this case that we would other similarly situated cases, and we choose not to prosecute.
In Terry Moran, who is out in front of the Supreme Court today. Terry was covering the oral arguments in front of the Supreme Court today on the other big story of the day. And now, obviously, Terry, we all turn our attention to this. As Pierre and Catherine and Mary have laid out, there are now two lanes. And when we first heard that one sentence from the report, and we've looked through this report, and we've pulled all sorts of information out of the pertinent criminal information. But when we heard elderly, well-meaning man with trouble remembering, that's not a good look, arguably, for the president. But now, as Mary lays out these details that we are getting, that he couldn't remember when his term ended, this now feels a little different than when we first heard that first sentence.
And absolutely, Phil. And Mary, reports that the White House is pushing back hard. They're saying this was unfair, improper, that they're going after the president. These are not political opponents. These are lawyers, investigators, prosecutors for the Department of Justice that reports to President Biden. They are trying to put the facts before the American people. And among those facts that they believe are relevant is that Biden is a well-meaning old man who has a poor memory, and that he couldn't remember specific things, and that was one of the reasons that they considered that at trial, that's how he would present himself to a jury. That in the common parlance, he might look doddering and sympathetic and well-meaning like somebody's grandfather. That's not going after Joe Biden. That's describing him, the investigators are. They're describing what they saw and how it factored into this investigation. That is a doubly damning line politically for the president, because it doesn't come from political enemies. It comes from his employees, whose job it was to find the facts here.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that with ABC News legal contributor and professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law, Kim Whaley. Kim, when we first heard that in the report, that might have been a reason not to move forward with criminal charges, or that's how he would present at trial, that's not how people make decisions on who to prosecute or not. As Terry was saying, that's more of an observation of how he was when they interviewed him, right?
Well, they made two major conclusions. One is that there was no evidence to find that he violated the law criminally beyond a reasonable doubt. That was number one. There was insufficient evidence. Number two, they said there's other mitigating factors, including that the jurors could decide, having looked to his, how he carries himself at 8 years in office, vice president. It's a heavy job even for younger people, that he just made an honest mistake. But the critical fact is they honestly, the report sort of fudges this a little. It says he willfully retained documents, but then later it says specifically that there is not sufficient evidence that he intended to break the law. And that's the criminal standard. So it's not so much, oh, Joe Biden is an old person that is doddering or has a bad memory. It's that they just don't have evidence that he violated the law, whether he's president or not. And the point also here is that if he weren't president, this would never be made public. The Department of Justice does not give reasons for deciding not to prosecute. And even under the special counsel regulations that apply here, this report is supposed to be confidential. So these are discretionary factors that a prosecutor will take into account to decide if there's a crime, and even if there is a crime, are there going to be issues bringing this to trial and persuading a jury? And I think the top of the line here is that there just wasn't evidence that he actually committed a crime.
Kim, thank you. ABC News political director Rick Klein joins me now. Rick, politically, looking forward, just a few hours ago, we were talking about politically how these arguments in the Supreme Court with Donald Trump this morning were going to play out. Now we have to talk about politically how this report plays out. On the surface, one would say, oh, it's going to be just fine for the president. They didn't find anything to move forward with. But it doesn't seem to be the case with how the special prosecutor is describing the president here.
This blows wide open what has been a rather quiet, a little bit hushed discussion over President Biden's age and memory and ability to do the job. The details in this special counsel's report in describing why they didn't bring that prosecution, as we've been reporting this afternoon, not knowing exactly when he was vice president, not knowing within the range of years when his son passed away, and even the details of how these documents were stored. They said next to an old Zappos box. This is not the depiction of a president who's ready to go for another 4 years. It is going to be weaponized, surely, by his political rivals, and I would anticipate you're going to have quite a few more Democrats beginning to ask the questions that some other Democrats have been asking for some time, including Congressman Dean Phillips, who's really the most credible primary challenger against Biden so far, that there has to be a serious discussion about Biden's ability to do the job. There has to be some serious discussion about whether he is up to the job for another 4 years. And all of that has been beneath the surface of a party that has tried to rally behind a president whose popularity is lagging, but is matched up against a man who, yes, is facing 4 sets of criminal charges, including for his handling of classified documents, which, again, objectively is a much more serious matter in every way, shape, or form, as the special counsel acknowledges, than anything that Biden is accused of doing. But the damage to him politically is potentially very significant. And an angry denial and letters from White House counsel and personal counsel to the president, that can only go so far. It is here in black and white, significant lapses in his own memory, and even that depiction of him as a well-meaning old man who has memory lapses, that is a hard thing to square with saying that's someone that you want to lead the country for another 4 years.
And Rick, it's not just a political issue for Donald Trump and the Republicans who want to replace Joe Biden, but the president really has to worry about a lot of this from his own party, because it's a good portion of the country that thinks both of these candidates are too old to be doing this job. Now you have this, so it's not just the other side, right? It's from his own party he needs to worry about this now.
That's right, Phil. And we're in an awkward state for that discussion to happen in the context of primary nominating contests. We've now got 3 contests down, including most recently Nevada, the South Carolina primary, where Biden got 97% of the vote. He is going to be the Democratic nominee unless he were to decide that he is not going to seek that nomination, unless he were to decide that he were to step aside, and even that would be complicated at this time. So I've talked to a lot of Democrats who've hoped for this conversation to surface more fully a long time ago, when there'd still be an opportunity to kind of figure that out through the course of a competitive primary process. Joe Biden, for whatever series of reasons, really didn't have to worry about that. Other than some real token opposition from Marianne Williamson and from Congressman Dean Phillips, he has been able to skate through the primaries without doing a lot of campaigning, without having to sit for a lot of interviews, without doing a whole lot of trail work. And when he's out there, he's in a more kind of cautious and closed down form. But this depiction of him, again, in a special counsel's report, and people are going to undermine his thoughts on this. This is someone that was a holdover from the Trump years. There's lots of theories that could go into the thinking of why he went into the kind of detail that he did. It is a very damaging one for a president, for a White House, for a re-election campaign that's trying to say, look, we got this. This man is in good shape. He's in good health, and he's ready to go forward for another 4 years. These are really, really tough details to get around. And again, just the whole idea that this prosecution might not go forward or unless or because of, in part, the president's own mental limitations at his age is really startling. And to me, potentially more politically damaging than even charges might have been if we were talking about an alternate world today, Phil.
Yeah, yes. Rick, we have. John Carl joins me here at the desk. John, I want to take this step by step because this does feel, no charges. Still, there are political ramifications. It does feel a little bit like what happened in the 2016 election, just before the election with Hillary Clinton. But it's not just black and white. You may not be facing any kind of criminal prosecution coming out of one of these reports, but it still can be damning. I know you've been digging through the report. Give us the highlights.
Well, first of all, there is damning information in this report, and usually when a prosecutor makes a decision not to prosecute, the decision is made. It's not announced. You don't hold a press conference or issue a report detailing all the things you found and then explaining why ultimately, even though you discovered all of this troubling information, you decided not to indict. But this is a special counsel. The special counsel is required by Department of Justice policy to issue a confidential report to the Attorney General. The Attorney General then can decide on his own whether or not to share it with Congress or to make it public. And Merrick Garland, in the interest of transparency, decided to make this public. I imagine that's a decision that the White House ultimately is very uncomfortable with, because this does portray Biden in a very troubling light. There's the question you were just discussing with Rick about his memory, and not just why, one of the reasons that Hur gives for not moving forward with the prosecution is that quote that I'm sure we're going to hear over and over again, that a jury would see him as, an elderly man with a faulty memory. But there's descriptions in this report of his interview. He sat for 5 hours with special counsel Hur and describe him as sometimes not knowing when his term as vice president ended, when it began. This is troubling. But then on the substance, he had documents that were stored in the garage, that were stored at his, in Delaware, at his home in Virginia. He had documents, in several different locations. The photograph of Joe Biden's garage in Wilmington looks strikingly similar to the photographs that we saw at Mar-a-Lago of documents just kind of strewn around. In Mar-a-Lago, they were in a bathroom. They were on a stage in a ballroom. Here, they're next to his treadmill and his Corvette. And again, the circumstances are very different. Trump refused to turn the documents over. Even when he was subpoenaed, he directed people on his staff, allegedly, to destroy evidence, to lie. In this case, by the way, there's also an allegation of destruction of evidence in this report. And that is that one of the things that special counsel Hur details is that Biden shared the information with a ghostwriter for two books that he wrote. Now, what the special counsel says is there's no evidence that any classified information that he shared with that ghostwriter ended up in the book, but he shared the information with the ghostwriter. And those interviews were recorded. Now, according to Hur, the ghostwriter, after it was learned that the special counsel would be investigating, destroyed the tape recordings of his interviews with Biden. Now, what the special counsel says is that he voluntarily turned over the computer. The forensic team at DOJ was able to recover the voice recordings. But that is, again, so not only do you have an allegation of classified information, including, by the way, some very highly classified information. According to this report, among the information that Biden had was information that was at the top secret special compartmentalized information categorization, that is TSSCI. That is among the most sensitive of our nation's secrets. So you have that allegation, and you have an allegation of obstruction of justice. Again, not Biden himself, but Biden's ghostwriter. It muddies the waters, and you can be sure Republicans will be able to use this information, ample information, this 300-plus pages.
Stay with me for 1 second. I want to go to Jay O'Brien because we're told he has a statement. Jay, is the statement from the president?
Yeah, Phil, we just got the statement from President Biden himself. The other was from the White House. This is the first paragraph. The president says, quote, "I was pleased to see they being the special counsel, reach the conclusion I believed all along they would reach, that there were no charges brought in this case and the matter is now closed." He goes on to say, quote, "I have worked always to protect America's security. I take these issues seriously, and no one has ever questioned that." That was the first paragraph and the last paragraph. In the middle there is notable, Phil, because nowhere in this statement does the president himself address those comments that special counsel Hur made about the president's memory. The president's lawyers called those comments prejudicial. The president doesn't address that in this statement. Instead, he talks about the interview in which he had with the special counsel, in which those allegations or those comments about the president's memory arose from. And President Biden says, quote, that he had that 5-hour interview, as John just mentioned, with the special counsel, and it occurred, I'll quote directly here, over 2 days on October 8th and 9th of last year, even though Israel had just been attacked on October 7th, and I was in the middle of handling an international crisis. So again, the president doesn't talk about his memory there, but in a sense he says he was busy during that long-standing, ongoing international crisis in which he also fit in this interview with the special counsel, where the special counsel said that the president had these hazy memory lapses, if you will. One more point of order here, Phil, is that I've been tracking here on Capitol Hill the response response we've been getting from Republican lawmakers who are in the middle of an ongoing impeachment inquiry into the president. Now, this classified documents matter really isn't factored much into that impeachment inquiry up until perhaps this point, but I can tell you 95% of the reaction we've been getting from congressional Republicans at this hour has very little to do with the law or the legal questions in this report. All of the reaction, or practically all of it we've seen from Republicans right now, is talking about these issues of the president's memory that have arisen in this report. Even the House Judiciary Committee is tweeting quotes of this report. Again, not on the legal questions right now, but on those notions of the president's memory and the haziness, the special counsel says, of it in those interviews.
Yeah, this is one of those things that in a social media age, these quotes are going to get out there quite quickly. Jay, stand by. I want to turn to ABC News legal contributor and trial attorney at Hamilton Clark LLP, Brian Buckmeyer. I want to bring in Brian. And Brian, when you're taking a look at a report like this, we'll talk about the political ramifications with some of the other folks on the panel. But legally, when you look at this and you hear the president saying he was pleased to see them come to the realization that he thought they always were going to, when you look at this report, legally, what does it say to you?
Legally, it says that whether or not President Biden was in office or out of office, there are not enough facts here to support a prosecution. From a legal standpoint, this is great. This shows that the Biden, whether his memory be insufficient or waiving in some areas, that the facts don't ally for any kind of prosecution, and that he doesn't even need the guard of the presidency.
And Brian, when the report comes with the pictures that we see, John Carl was just talking about it, how, you know, it is damning in that sense where it does look a little bit like the other documents case that we've been following, even though it's very different. You know, we're told President Biden's attorneys alerted to some of these documents, so it's very different. But when you're seeing documentation like that, how does a report like this sit with the general public, anybody who's going to be interested in it?
You know,
it's not good. You have to create a sense of distinction between what President Biden's pictures look like, what former President Donald Trump's pictures look like, and then allow for the facts to distinguish. When you look at it just on its face value, it is bad. It looks like these documents are just kind of thrown about in a kind of haphazard way. And then how can you say they're properly taken care of? But if you distinguish between what the former president did in terms of how those items ended up looking like that they were tossed to the side, so to speak, that they were hidden from law enforcement who were trying to search for these documents, while for President Biden, he's doing a lot of different things, whether it be running for presidency or in an elected position or appointed position. The narrative just changes based on the distinguishing factors, but the pictures, those aren't good.
And John Carl's back at the desk with me. John, you know better than most that politics is partly perception. And we have the report. We've looked through the report. We have the decision of the report. But this report now lives sort of in this universe, this political universe.
Yeah, again, you're in this highly unusual situation, although it does echo what happened with Hillary Clinton in 2016 with James Comey and the whole emails investigation, where in both instances you have a decision not to pursue criminal charges, but you have a prosecutor unloading what was in the investigation, including a lot of very damning information. I think one thing that is notable is that he had these classified notes, his notebooks, and when the special counsel asked him about these notebooks, he got very defensive and said, "These are my notebooks, this is my property. Every president has done this before." And according to the report, President Biden pointed to Ronald Reagan, who famously kept diaries every single day he was in the White House, except for the day that he was shot. You know, but he kept his diaries. Some of those diaries had some classified information, and Biden pointed out there were never any prosecutions there. And Hur concedes that is a point that a jury could find compelling. But he also says Biden should have known that you can take notes. If the information's classified, it's still classified. Yeah. You can't take that. You can't take that back with you. So that's, you know, one critical point. But I keep coming back to the question that rather shocking statement that the special counsel makes in here about Biden's memory, about how a jury would likely look at him. He would present himself to a jury, and he says, as he presented himself to the special counsel in the interview, as an elderly man with a faulty memory. And then they get into some specifics about that faulty memory, which is you know, during the interview. And I want to read a little bit. This is from the report. This is page 208 in the report. In his interview with our office, Mr. Biden's memory was worse. He did not remember when he was vice president, forgetting the first day of the interview when his term ended. If it was 2013, when did I stop becoming vice president? And forgetting on the second day of the interview when his term began. I'm 2009, I'm still vice president. He did not remember, even within several years, when his son Beau died. I mean, these are pretty shocking statements in this report. Now, again, the White House, as you've heard from Jay and others, has pushed back and said that the characterization of the president's memory is not accurate, that this was a full-blown, it was a 5-hour interview. And they also point out that the interview happened while he was dealing with the fallout from the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel. So, he had a lot going on. But to see that stuff in print, quoting an interview under oath that President Biden did with the special counsel, this gets beyond now a legal problem.
Right.
It becomes a major political problem, and perhaps the kind of problem that has Democrats wondering, what they're going to do about it.
And it's not happening in a vacuum either. This has been talked about for quite some time. Both political parties talking about the age of their nominees or their presumptive nominees here, and this is just going to be fodder for one side and concern for the other moving forward, because we haven't, as Rick Klein pointed out, seen a lot of President Biden in public. Canceled isn't going to do the halftime interview.
I mean, not doing a Super Bowl interview.
Right.
I mean, that's free publicity.
That's a gimme.
Why is he not doing that? But it also makes you wonder if part of that decision is they knew this report was coming and they knew how damaging this report would be. So that may well have been a benefactor as well.
All right, Jonathan Karl, always good to have your expertise on this, and we thank the rest of our panel as well. Well, we put a button on that, and we will come back to it. We are going to move on. The other top story of the day that we are following out of Washington just before this broke, a history unfolding at the U.S. Supreme Court as justices hearing oral arguments over whether former President Trump can be kicked off Colorado's 2024 primary ballot for his role in January 6th. It is the biggest election case since Bush versus Gore 24 years ago now, and it all comes down to one clause in the 14th Amendment, which declares that no one who has taken an oath to support the Constitution and then engaged in insurrection can hold public office afterward. Colorado became the first state to kick Trump off their ballot after a case brought by 6 voters. Maine quickly followed, and other states are currently considering. But it all really comes down to the justices in this decision on Colorado, which could allow other cases to move forward. We have ABC News team coverage leading us off right now. ABC News senior Washington reporter Devin Dwyer, who was actually inside the courtroom today during the arguments, senior reporter Catherine Falders, our legal contributor and trial attorney Brian Buckmeyer all join me right now. Devin, let's start with you. Give us a sense of what it was like to be inside that courtroom. I know I was listening to every word, but you were there on such a monumental day.
Monumental is the word, Phil, and I know there's major news coming out about President Biden, but today here at the Supreme Court, a major question of politics, something that these justices don't engage in as we are now in the presidential campaign. Can Donald Trump be kicked off the ballot in a number of states, Colorado first among them, because he's an insurrectionist under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment? A simply historic question that has never been considered before by the Supreme Court, and today you felt that history in the room, Phil. Donald Trump wasn't here, but this was a packed courtroom shrouded in extra security. There were some demonstrators out here this morning. The wives of the justices were here by tradition, and these arguments stretched over 2 hours. And I have to say the big takeaway from here at the Supreme Court is that all 9 justices, including the 3 liberal justices, voiced a good bit of skepticism that Colorado can do this on its own accord under the Constitution. There was a lot of focus about who gets to enforce enforce that 150-year-old provision in the Constitution that's been rarely tested. You put it up on the screen a minute ago, and that is when someone engages in insurrection, having taken an oath to represent the United States, who gets to decide that they are disqualified? And there was a lot of wrangling over that. Not so much talk about Donald Trump himself and the conduct he engaged in to overturn results of the election, Phil, but it was pretty clear that the Supreme Court is taking a skeptical eye at what Colorado has done.
And Brian, talk to us a little bit about the central arguments from both sides in this case.
Well, Phil, the central argument that the Supreme Court is listening to is whether or not Colorado erred in disbarring the former President Donald Trump from the ballot. When you break those down, the fundamental questions are, does the state have the power to conduct its own elections and put its own people on ballots based on their interpretation of a federal statute, or Article 3 of the 14th Amendment? The other issue is whether or not the former president is covered under the insurrection clause, again, Article 3 of the 14th Amendment, in that, is he an officer? Is he an officer of the court? President isn't enumerated or specifically listed in that list of positions that are barred after an insurrection. And who gets to determine what an insurrectionist is? Because there doesn't seem to be any real form of litigation. The question being, can states do that themselves? And we have a patchwork of rules throughout this country.
Right, and even President Trump's attorney arguing before the Supreme Court today had a little bit of a different definition of an insurrection than his client. Catherine, how is the former president responding to all this? We were on air when it happened. It did not take long for him to get in front of a camera. What did he say?
Very predictable response from the former president when his attorneys appear in really any courtroom across the country. Of course, he came before cameras today, the former president, saying that he was listening to this Supreme Court hearing, that it was a beautiful process. He claimed the arguments were very strong and well received. But I think the bottom line here is this is also a former president who's facing 91 criminal counts in various different courts across the country. He essentially says the same thing when he speaks after these arguments. He wasn't there in person today, I should note, as you've heard Devin say, but that doesn't mean he's not using this as an opportunity to respond and speak after it. He's essentially turning appearances in courtrooms into political rallies, in a sense. So we heard him pivot to policy and talk about the border and January 6th and all sorts of other things. But this is something that you will continue to see frequently from the former president as he has to, or as he decides to, rather, go to these hearings in the various different cases and charges that he's facing in different jurisdictions across the country.
Devin, Justice Clarence Thomas has been getting calls to recuse himself from this case. Explain why and what kind of role he's playing here.
That's absolutely right, Phil. I mean, one of the elements of drama in today's hearing was not just Clarence Thomas, but the 3 Trump appointees who are now sitting in judgment in effect of the former president. But Clarence Thomas, the most senior conservative on this court, has a wife, Ginny Thomas, who is a conservative activist who was at the rally on January 6th, who is an active booster of Donald Trump right now, and who also actively participated in efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election. Clarence Thomas was here today. He didn't recuse, but we talked to a number of people ahead of today's case, including some leading judicial ethicists who said this was a clear-cut case and the court is already violating its ethics code. Take a listen.
He will be ruling on a case that could determine whether or not the events his wife participated in amounted to an insurrection against the United States of America.
Top Democrats have implored Justice Thomas to step aside.
I'm afraid Justice Thomas, through his family, has crossed that line, and he should recuse himself so there's no question of bias in his decision.
But his defenders say their calls are nothing more than a political ploy.
I think there are people who would like to see Justice Thomas not deciding this case, and therefore they're going to attack him.
Phil is dug in. He was here today. He is on deck to decide other potential cases involving the 2020 election coming before him. But whatever this court says in the coming days and weeks, make no mistake that Justice Thomas's role in that decision will be highly scrutinized, Phil.
All right. And Brian, just quickly, when do you think we see a decision here?
It's really reading tea leaves, but I could tell you that the end of the session for the Supreme Court comes at the end of June, sometimes early July, so months, if not sooner. I would expect the Supreme Court justices, to know that many other states are looking at this to say whether or not Trump can be on the ballot. So hopefully sooner rather than later, but end of June the latest.
Catherine Faulders and Brian Buckmeyer, thank you all very much. Meantime, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office says 7 people have now been indicted in connection with the caught-on-camera assault on 2 New York City police officers.
Is telling me to stand.
The DA's office and the NYPD had asked for the public's help in identifying individuals connected to this assault on a police lieutenant and an officer in Times Square. ABC News senior investigative correspondent Aaron Katersky joins me now. And Aaron, what are you learning at this hour about this?
We know that 7 people have now been indicted. That's a change from just yesterday when only 1 was indicted. But police and prosecutors now believe 11 people were involved, but only 1 is actually in custody. They're still looking for some. Others were released on their own recognizance, and it remains to be seen whether they show up for their return dates to court. So the prosecutors are still defending themselves in not asking for bail in this case for several of these defendants, saying that the role each person played wasn't clear. It's clear to them now, they say. They believe 11 were involved on the assault of these 2 officers.
And 2 people who've been indicted will not be identified until their arraignment. Is that the case? And if so, when can we expect that to happen?
We don't know the exact arraignment date, but it's common when these indictments are not sealed for the defendant names to be sealed along with the indictments until the arraignment date. We'll find out then who exactly they are. They were all hanging out outside a migrant shelter in Times Square. Police said that they were blocking the sidewalk. Officers dispersed the crowd. And they're also now looking to see how many of these 11 people that were involved may also be involved in other crimes around the city, because they believe, Phil, these were not necessarily asylum seekers that the city's been trying to help. There may be a criminal element here at work, too.
Interesting. I'll just sort it all out. All right, Aaron Katersky. Aaron, thank you. Developing now, a tragic ending in the search for 5 missing Marines after their helicopter went down near San Diego. The U.S. military now confirming the 5 Marines are in fact dead. Their chopper went down in the mountains of San Diego earlier this week. ABC News Chief National Correspondent Matt Gutman near the crash site with more.
Phil, earlier this morning, the Marines announcing the death of the 5 crew members who were aboard that CH-53E Sea Stallion. It's known as the workhorse of the Marines, crashing about 45 miles from where we are right now in Pine Valley. It was, they said, on a routine nighttime mission flying from Creech Air Base in Las Vegas to the Miramar Marine Base here in San Diego. But what was not routine was the weather. It was at the tail end, and we're still feeling the dregs of it now, of this brutal 3-day storm that pummeled Southern California with record rain over the past several days. And there in the mountains where we were, it was not rain, it was sleet and snow, and it was blustery. And so a lot of people are asking themselves right now, did they have to fly that routine nighttime training mission? Was that what maybe brought the helicopter down? No word yet from the Marines on what might have caused the crash, whether it was weather-related or possibly having to do with mechanics, avionics, or anything like that. All they have said so far is that the helicopter went down, that the 5 crew members aboard have been killed, and that they're now working on the recovery despite pretty tough conditions out there. There's a 1-lane dirt track, now a mud track, leading to the area around the crash site. That's the only way in and out, and we were told that some of the rescuers had to walk on foot a fair distance just to get to there. So they're working on the recovery, they're working on identifying next of kin, and of course the investigation. And that last part is probably going to take some time to unravel here. Phil.
All right, Matt Gutman in Pine Valley, California. Matt, thank you. And thank you for streaming with us. I'm Phil Lipoff. ABC News Live is here for you anytime with the latest news, context, and analysis. And you can always find us on various streaming services, the ABC News app, and of course, abcnews.com. The news never stops, so we'll be right back.
With so much at stake, so much on the line, more Americans turn here than any other newscast. ABC News World News Tonight with David Muir, America's #1 most watched newscast across all of television.
Give it to me.
It's lunchtime in America, so what are we serving up?
Well, how about everything you need to know?
You know, that sounds pretty good.
Give it to me. Your health, your money, breaking news, pop culture, with the biggest stars, music, trends, and of course, good food. GMA 3, what you need to know. A third hour of GMA in the afternoon.
So join us, afternoons.
For everything you need to know. I love that.
To me.
Oh my. Y'all tuning in for Taylor Swift. You're gonna be tuning in for Usher too.
You're gonna do it big.
Oh my God.
They say Oscar, Tony, Grammy, Emmy. You should put Super Bowl on there too.
Baby, let me love you.
Usher Raymond is going to get shirtless. I don't think it'll break any FCC violations. Go shirtless.
Hey man, that's what I do. It's Usher, baby.
Yeah!
Usher, My Way to the Super Bowl. This is Impact by Nightline, now streaming on Hulu. From America's #1 news source,